I'm Joanna Marsh, the James Dickey Curator of Contemporary Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Smithsonian American Art Museum this evening for what I think will be a really fascinating program. Before we begin, if I could just ask everyone to turn off mobile phones and other mobile devices during the program. There's going to be a short question and answer period following the lecture tonight, and we just ask that if you do have a question, if you could use one of the two microphones that's set up midway up the auditorium in the aisles so that the audience who's tuning in via webcast can hear your questions as well. Tonight's program is the second lecture in a three-part series called Collectors Roundtable. Each session offers insights and invaluable advice on building a collection and features museum directors, curators, dealers, and private collectors like our speaker this evening. The series is going to conclude next month in May with Washington, D.C. art collector Robert Blairman, who will talk about his collection of contemporary American and European artworks. For tonight, I am really thrilled to be able to welcome Helen Zell, who has traveled from Chicago to be with us this evening, and it's a real pleasure. Helen is executive director of the Zell Family Foundation and a past chairman of the board of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. She currently serves as chair of their collections committee and has been active for over 25 years with that museum. She also serves on numerous other boards, including the Chicago Public Education Fund, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and the Steppenwolf Theater Company. And she's an avid supporter of the University of Michigan's Masters in Fine Arts Creative Writing program. I met Helen almost 2 years ago during the summer of 2009 while I was touring public and private collections in Chicago, so I'm particularly pleased to be able to welcome her to Washington tonight, having lured her here for the evening. During our first visit together, we spent almost 2 hours touring her extraordinary collection of surrealist paintings and sculpture that she and her husband Sam have amassed over the last 15 years together. And each object had a unique story, and Helen related these anecdotes with an astounding depth of knowledge and a tremendous, really infectious enthusiasm for the material. And I sort of fell in love with Helen and fell in love with her collection during that first visit. And we met again a year later in Chicago, and she eagerly shared news of a new acquisition with me, which also signaled a new direction in her collecting, which I think you'll hear about tonight, a turn towards contemporary art. So we chatted about artists, and we talked about collecting stewardship, and Helen gave a lot of insights about how museums and individuals should responsibly care for their collections. And I thought in that moment it was so rare to meet a collector whose passion was matched by a sense of pragmatism as well. And I knew immediately that she would be perfect for this Collectors Roundtable series. And so we invited her to speak, and I am thrilled that she accepted the invitation, and it is my pleasure to introduce her now.
Thank you, Joanna. It's humbling. So, from paper dolls to La Poupée. As promised in the short blurb describing my talk tonight, I want to consider, in addition to looking at art, the profile of a collector. Specifically, this collector: the obsessive, the scholar, the curator, the conserver, and the participant in the global art world. I began this journey roughly 60 years ago, eagerly anticipating the arrival of the latest edition of Katie Keene Comics at the local convenience store a few blocks from my home. Every issue devoted one page to Katie and her costumes. Contemporary collectors of vintage Katie Keene comics are instructed by, quote, those in the know, to be sure the paper doll page is intact, not destroyed by some thoughtless child. I was that child, meticulously cutting out Katie and the glamorous apparel designed for her by her fans everywhere. Week after week, issue after issue, dressing Katie led to the creation of an ongoing narrative of her life. With every new issue, the fantasy continued. Like many other healthy obsessions, I also faced the issue of how to store my paper doll collection. I settled on discarded issues of Good Housekeeping magazine. The cutouts from each weekly edition were filed between the pages of the magazine. Eventually, I had 3 magazines carefully stuffed with Katie and her extensive wardrobe. After about 3 years of this, Katie lost her allure, and I moved on. I was also a voracious reader, which prompted my initial foray into a lifelong passion for owning books. The Bobbsey twins was the first in this collection effort, a classic example of the desire to own multiple works in an author's or an artist's oeuvre. All the books were displayed in the order of publication on a shelf in my bedroom. So, what possible relevance might paper dolls and books have in my surreal universe today? The word poupée is French for doll. In the 1930s, Hans Bellmer, a German surrealist, created a series of doll-like figures made from mannequin parts and photographed them in mysterious and surreal settings. He then incorporated the photos into limited edition artist books. This is a particularly beautiful example. It's tiny, maybe about 4 inches by 3 inches, and all of the paper is handmade, and the little pictures of the dolls are very carefully tipped in inside. And there's like an actual lace doily, a paper lace doily on the front. And these are images that appear in miniature within. There are different versions of La Poupée, some done in collaboration with other artists and poets. Some of the bindings are unique, and all of them reflect the artist's hand. It is not surprising that Bellmer is well represented in our collection. On another shelf in my childhood bedroom, and I only wish I had a photo of this, but I don't, a collection of small dolls began to emerge. Each doll was dressed to reflect the stereotypical identity of its native country. They were called decoration dolls. My grandmother was the instigator in this case, bringing me souvenirs from her travels abroad. Eager to expand the collection, although not a great traveler at this stage, I started doing my own research. The Book of Knowledge, our only reference book in the house, was my search engine, and the local department store served as my gallery. The overarching goal, to acquire a doll representing every country in the world. I was very ambitious when I was 10. The display shelves increased as the dolls entered the collection, but my interest waned before achieving the goal. I moved on to a typical teenage obsession with stuffed animals. Had I grown up in the 90s, I probably would have been a huge fan of Beanie Babies. I still enjoy the quest for multiple objects belonging to a specific genre. One vintage robot from the 50s is interesting. 36 robots make a visual statement. And the same applies to my collection of miniature models of famous buildings. In this case, the collection is limited to the size of the table. You're seeing it now probably mid-collection. Currently, it's filled chock-a-block, including the little round platform below. So I think this collection may have seen its day. Enter the curator. You had only to step into my childhood bedroom to know how my collections defined my physical space. Nothing stashed in a closet or a drawer, everything carefully arranged on shelves, my bed, or a tabletop. And when a new object entered the collection, there was another opportunity to reassemble everything, all of the constituents, all over again. The size of each collection was defined by the amount of space in which I could create a visually satisfying display. Obsession limited by compulsivity, two very strong components of my persona. My tiny room certainly influenced this embryonic collector. A robust teenage rebellion put collecting pretty much on the back burner. There was a brief encounter with matchbook covers, probably resulting from a new fascination with risky behavior. The empty covers were displayed in ready-made albums, usually designed to accommodate them. This was not my finest hour as a curator. The collection was very loosely organized at the beginning, but the obsessive gene surfaced again, leading to the desire to categorize the material. Hotels, restaurants, product advertising, party favors, etc. A family member visited the Nautilus submarine and brought me a souvenir matchbook, forcing me to create a new category, exotic destinations. When I graduated from high school, my grandparents took me on my first trip to Europe. There were many firsts, among them a heavy dose of museum visits, and I couldn't get enough. I embarked on a visual crash course in art history and began buying posters to chronicle my favorite exhibitions. The posters eventually found their way onto the walls of my first apartment, and I found the impact of these images extremely satisfying. In the late 60s, my then husband and I were working and finally generated sufficient disposable income to move from posters to lithography. Oh, big day. We purchased a Frank Gallo lithograph for the staggering sum of $125, framed. Whoa. And the gallery owner was kind enough to give us 2 months to pay for it. Summer art fairs in Chicago became a ritual, but despite the occasional art purchase, the beer and the bratwurst were probably the main attraction. A seminal moment occurred in the early 70s. We acquired our first painting, an abstract work by Robert Natkin entitled Reading View. The artist's cousin was a very good friend of mine, and she arranged a visit to the studio in New York to look at this work. I think I shook for like a month before going. I was so nervous. A very heady experience for a very naive collector. We, of course, fell in love with 2 paintings, but we could only afford 1, barely. Robert very generously solved our problem by offering us a very attractive deal. Buy the larger work, and I'll make a gift to you of the second. I still have this painting in our collection currently. It has very special emotional value, as you can imagine. It's beautiful, it's colorful. I don't think it was ever a great painting, but I love it the same. I will always love it, and I'll probably never part with it. So, during the 70s, I surrounded myself with a lot of colorful abstraction that created a very, very handsome decor. It wouldn't be inaccurate to say that I was stuck. And then one day, I wandered into the Museum of Contemporary Art during my lunch hour. My initial visits were not what I would call comfortable. The work was frequently inscrutable and often very confrontational, but it was almost always intellectually challenging. And as exemplified by my first look at a Dan Flavin light tube installation, extremely beautiful. I also learned at that time that 2 of the MCA's founders, Joseph Shapiro and Ed Bergman, were major collectors of Surrealist painting and sculpture. Now things start getting a little more interesting. In 1983, I joined the Women's Board at the MCA, which I initially perceived to be a fundraising arm of the institution. This was true, but I later discovered that many of the members of this group were avid collectors of both modern and contemporary art. Affiliation with the group gave me entree into many of the private collections in Chicago, which would ultimately end up in places like the Art Institute Chicago, the Metropolitan in New York, and the MCA. It was an invaluable education which would eventually pay great dividends in ways I couldn't then even imagine. Now let's move ahead quickly to 1995. In May of 1995, I ran into an old friend at the opening night of the Chicago International Art Exposition on Navy Pier. Both newly single, we started dating. And by 1996, we were back at the pier, standing in front of an early painting by Jean Dubuffet. The painting is called Voyage de Noces, or translated Honeymoon. It was done in 1943. It's very, very early Dubuffet and not typical of his later work except for the color, perhaps. For obvious reasons, not the least of which was the emotional impact, we adored the picture. And in the next 15 minutes, Sam closed the deal. I didn't know what had hit me. I was blown away. The following year, we returned to Art Expo and headed immediately to the same gallery. We were not disappointed. Coupled with Rooster, a painting by Heinrich Campendonck, would make a fascinating companion to Honeymoon. The two paintings have been installed side by side in our home ever since. During roughly the same period of time in 1997, a longtime friend of Sam's, and also an inveterate collector, introduced us to vintage Czech photography, eventually transferring his entire collection of this Czech photographer to us, one piece, two pieces at a time. We ended up with a group of pictures that I think numbered about 50 or 51. A chunk of them being deaccessioned not too long ago, but at one time there were about 51 pieces. And I adored the work. I couldn't get enough of it. I mean, whether I should have 51 pieces, I don't know, but it's that collector thing that just doesn't let you stop. They're exquisitely beautiful, all pretty much dealing with the female form. He also sold us this iconic work, which you may recognize. This is a picture of Lewis Hines. It's called The Powerhouse Mechanic. The image is from 1920 and was represented to us by the seller as a vintage print, meaning that it was printed by Hines when he was alive. This turned out not to be the case. But it also afforded us an excellent opportunity to be initiated into the often vague arena of vintage photography. The day this picture was delivered to our temporary apartment, as we were remodeling, I couldn't open it fast enough. I mean, this was really exciting. This was a picture that I recognized. I've seen it in museums. I mean, I just really felt I knew this photograph very well. And I tore into it. I opened it up. It's absolutely gorgeous. And what do I want to do? I want to share this information with somebody who will understand. So I call up my friend Alan Coppell, who is a longtime friend and also a gallerist in Chicago. And he's a big collector of photography. And I said, Alan, I have the most wonderful news. I have to tell somebody, you must see this. I just got The Powerhouse Mechanic. It's here. I just opened it. It's stellar. And he said, oh, I really would like to see it. You know, I'd love to see it. You know, why don't you bring it over to the gallery? I said, okay, I'll bring it over tomorrow. So I go over to the gallery, and we open it up, and he starts looking at it. And I can see he's a little bit reserved. And I said, is there anything wrong? I mean, is it, you know, don't you like it? And he said, oh, no, I love it. It's a stunning image. It's really beautiful. It's gorgeous. You know, what can I say? It's a beautiful, beautiful picture. But I'd like to spend some time with it. Do you mind if I keep it for a couple of days? I said, no, be my guest. And I leave merrily on my way. 2 days later, he calls me. And now he sounds really dour. I mean, it's like somebody died. And I said, Alan, what's wrong? He said, Helen, I hate to say this to you, but this picture is too beautiful. This picture, in my opinion, is too large. It's too pretty. It's, on the wrong kind of paper. This is not a picture that is a vintage print of Lewis Hines. This is probably a picture that somebody who was very closely associated with him, a man named Walter Rosenblum, printed after Hines died. And I said, well, what does that mean? I mean, it's still a beautiful picture. He said, well, what did you pay for it? And I tell him what I paid for it. He said, well, if the picture is vintage, that would be the appropriate amount. If the picture's not, and it's a Rosenblum print of the negative, it probably should cost about $95,000 less than what you paid for it. My knees get weak, I feel like rubbery, I'm gonna faint, and I said, well, what do we do now? He said, well, what you have to do immediately is take this back to the person that you bought it from, because I happen to know a lot more about the backstory of this whole issue. And in a couple of months, there's gonna be a huge article in the New York Times revealing this whole story. So you've got to act now. You've got to just bite the bullet, go back to this guy that sold it to you and just tell him. So I can't get home fast enough, and I can't get on the phone fast enough. And I get the dealer, and I said, look, I just heard this horrible story, and for a variety of reasons, which I'm going to explain to you, I'm not keeping this. You have to make good on it. He said, oh, not to worry, because this is an old friend of my husband's, so he's not going to be difficult. But he was surprised. I could tell that it was very surprising to him. So he takes the picture back, we get our money back, and I'm relieved. Roughly 6 weeks later, the article hit the New York Times, and it was exactly as Alan had laid out to me. I mean, this huge scandal, and dealers there must have been 200 pieces that were involved. So it was a lot of money, and a lot of dealers that were made very uncomfortable and had difficulty making good on it. So a wonderful lesson learned. Don't be afraid of learning lessons the hard way. In my case, it was really the easy way, but it's still, it was a valuable lesson. In 1998, Sam and I got married, and at the same time, embarked on a major residential expansion. The project took about 2.5 years, which gave us ample time to focus on a collecting strategy. I still vividly remember a conversation during dinner. We were musing over a particularly delectable dessert, and he suddenly blurted out, so, are you interested in having a serious art collection? I was careful not to choke on my food, and I answered, well, sure. And he responded, so what do you want to collect? Before I could even process the request, he jumps in, well, I really love surrealism. I think that's what we should do. So, being the passive, dutiful wife, I said, sure, whatever I can do anything. Collecting, I like it all. I mean, it's all wonderful. I like abstract expressionism, I like surrealism, I like contemporary, surrealism it is. It's in the great tradition of Chicago collectors, I can do this. Up until now, we bought impulsively. The only overarching theme was the presence of the female form, generally nude. So what do? The next day, I pick up the phone, I call my friend Alan Coppell. Alan, we need to talk right away. I think I'm about to become a collector with a capital C. So he invites me to his gallery, and we sit down, and we start to strategize. And coincidentally, there had been a show at the museum, the Guggenheim in New York, featuring an extraordinary collection that had been put together by Daniel Philippaki and Nishui Ertegun. And the exhibition was called Surrealism, Two Private Eyes. And Alan had the catalogs from the exhibition in his gallery at the time. And we started looking. And we pored over these catalogs for days. I took them home, and I looked at them. And I, in essence, was making a wish list. If I could have anything I wanted, along with Sam, I would sort of cull it, and then I would say, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? And together, we made our ultimate wish list. And that's sort of how we began. Our collection building, to say the least, was impacted powerfully by being exposed to this stellar collection. The survey was vast. Joseph Cornell, Giorgio de Chirico, Salvador Dali, Max Ernst, Oscar Dominguez, Paul Delvaux, Rene Magritte, Yves Tanguy, Frida Kahlo, Victor Brauner, Dorothea Tanning, Kay Sage, Leonora Carrington, to name a few. We had our work cut out for us. And now I'd like to share some of the highlights of this frenetic period of acquisition with you. In these two slides, you'll see several examples of Joseph Cornell's mixed media boxes from 1952 to 1956. I believe this was the first one that we acquired. This was our first, the first Cornell that we had in the collection. This was one that came in much later, one of the hotel series, a very, very beautiful box. And actually, it appeared in the exhibition here at the Smithsonian. Two more, this is one of my favorites. I don't know if you can see here, but inside each one of these crystal-like balls, there is a little toy animal, some of them reminiscent of what you might find in a Cracker Jack box. And all of them have a different animal inside. And this is a more typical like navigation kind of situation. This is one of the first pictures that we purchased from the Philippe Aki collection. It's a picture of Paul Delvau's. It's called Les Deux Âges from 1941. Delvaux was a Belgian surrealist. I find this particularly fascinating. I've visited Ephesus several times, and there's something very reminiscent about the street that runs down the center of this picture, with the reference to the house of prostitution here, which exists in Ephesus, and this building here, I forget what it was called, but there's also a library on the other side, but this one also looks very much like what was in Ephesus. And then of course, the local Belgians looking very, very European, and then this wonderful woman symbolizing knowledge with her light. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture. Here's an example of a Spanish surrealist, Oscar Dominguez. This is a picture that was done in 1940. I've always referred to it as the whirling dervish picture. Sometimes it reminds me of like these alien movies where people are hooked up to some kind of a power source here. It's very oddly surreal and very, very bizarre, but lots of wonderful energy. Arshile Gorky is a particular favorite of mine. This untitled work from 1944 was particularly interesting to me because, not only because of the color, which I think is magnificent, but because Gorky's work provides a very interesting bridge from surrealism to abstract expressionism. He sort of was in both camps, and eventually was a huge devotee of de Kooning's. He worshipped de Kooning. And his work became more and more abstract. But in the beginning, there are all these strange little forms. Oh, sorry about that. Wait. These wonderful little forms almost look like little animals. And this is like a landscape of a farm area in Canberra, Australia. Wonderful picture by Max Ernst called Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, done in 1936. The perfect surrealist riff on the famous Manet painting. Another of my favorites, Frida Kahlo's Little Deer. Very iconic work that she did in 1946. For me, it reflects the incredible pain that she was going through, both psychological, with her dealings with her very difficult husband, Diego Rivera, and also her physical pain that was the result of a terrible accident when she was a child, and that she lived with for many, many, many years until she had like radical surgery, which is actually reflected in another image, which you'll see a few slides from now. Now, this was an exciting day when this came into the collection. I've always been a huge fan of Miro. This work, entitled The Head of the Catalan Peasant, I think is like one of the most extraordinary things I've ever seen. It's very early, different from a lot of the later pictures, incredibly surreal. And you can actually see the peasant, with his pipe and his beard, and then there are all these wonderful insects and flaming moons and cheese, and there's almost like a reference to Salvador Dali here. I mean, it's just fabulous. I love this. One of the intriguing things that happened at the same time that this came into the collection was this enormous challenge to present it properly. It came in a horrible frame, absolutely revolting. I don't know how anybody could have a picture like this and frame it the other way. I should have kept a picture of it. It was just just a real eyesore. So I decided, well, if we're going to really do this right, let's see if there's any history on how this was ever done before. And sure enough, in the catalog raisonné, there appears this wonderful picture of the framed painting in this very bizarre, unusual presentation. I think it looked like it was wood. There were butterflies attached to it. It was really quite fascinating, very surreal. My collection manager, Jennifer Smith, tried desperately to find the frame or any mention of the frame anywhere in any of the museums that had dealt with it, but there was nothing. Either people were not forthcoming, they wouldn't tell us, or maybe the information just didn't exist anymore. So at some point she said, you know, this is silly. Let's stop spinning our wheels. Let's make the frame. And I said, make the frame? She said, yes. You know, my husband, Noel, is an expert cabinet maker. We can do this. So we set out. We embarked on this wonderful project to make this frame. And long series of maquettes, starting very tiny to a full life-size model. Then a trip that Jennifer and Noel took to the East Coast where they located the wood in some little, byway near an inn that they were staying in. They packed up the wood, they brought it back to Chicago. Then we had the problem of milling it appropriately so that we could engender as much product as we needed to do the resulting frame. It goes off to the West Coast where it's milled, it comes back. And then finally, about 10 months after the inception of this project, we all meet at my local framer that does all of our framing, and we assembled. We put the image into the surrounding frame, and that was a glorious day. And then it all came home, and it was a huge amount of effort. It was very, very satisfying, and I think for me, who enjoys the curating and the display aspect of collecting, it was one of the real highs of the collecting experience. And now we have this wonderful sculpture by Miro. It's called the Moonbird. This is a very small, unique stone piece. You may be familiar with the very large bronze editions that appear in several places in New York that I'm familiar with, and perhaps others, but I don't know. But there's one that's in the sculpture garden at the Museum of Modern Art that appears most of the time. And then there's a gigantic one on the corner of, I think, 57th or 59th Street and Fifth Avenue. It is huge. It's the sort of the focal point of this wonderful building. I can't remember the man who developed it. It escapes me right now, but it's a fabulous piece, enormous. And this is this little tiny version of the same work. It's quite wonderful. Now, here's an interesting example of the sort of the convergence of material. We've been collecting photography and a lot that I haven't even shown you. Some, like a lot of Robert Frank from mid-century, from the American series. Lots of photography from the 50s, 40s and 50s. And we've also been collecting surrealism. And all of a sudden, it seemed to make a lot of sense to start looking at surrealist photography. I don't know what it took me so long. I mean, I guess I'm a slow study. But it all came together initially with these two incredible photographs of El Lissitzky. We have the portrait of Hans Arp over here, and then the negative image of the constructor. There are about, I think, several different versions of this. Most of them are positive images, and then there's one, I think there are 8 positives and 1 negative, and this is the only negative, but I think it's fascinating. You can see the hand here with the like this protractor thing, and then this wonderful ghost-like image of himself. And then this absolutely exquisite early solarization by Man Ray, the beautiful Swana. I think this is one of the most beautiful pictures I have ever seen, and I love his oeuvre. It's very spectacular, but this particular picture really just knocks my socks off. And here we have 2 women who worked in Mexico. They were peers of Frida Kahlo. We have Remedios Varo over here and Lenore Carrington on the right. Remedios Varo, the painting you see here is an excellent example of magical realism. She was very involved in the creation of these kinds of pictures. And to me, it seems like a very natural outgrowth of Surrealism. I mean, they were very surreal. Call it magic, call it surreal. To me, it resonates the same way. And then the companion is marvelous. You know, Carrington's portrait of the late Mrs. Partridge. I mean, I want to dress like this. And now we have two really strong members of the group. You're looking on the left at Giorgio de Chirico's very early metaphysical work called Melancholia. The picture was done in 1912, and I think this group of pictures is considered by many to be the beginnings of Surrealism. Like the movement can sort of come from that time, from these particular paintings. On the right, you have this wonderful picture by Salvador Dali called The Apparition of Delft. The wonderful car. I've seen this car in several different iterations, and it's just incredible. And this is a very interesting pairing. Dali has done an incredible portrait of his wife, Gala. We see her from behind, and she's sort of looking at her almost disembodied self. And then you go on out to the sky. And this picture sits on a window, not too close to the window, in our apartment, and it looks out to Lake Michigan. So we have Gala looking at herself, through the sky and then to the lake, and it's really stunning. And then we have over here Man Ray, also another portrait from behind, the iconic Violon d'Angre. We also see his indestructible object, and then Emmett Bacchia, another wonderful sculpture, all sort of related to this wonderful musical theme. Two of my favorites, especially the one on the left. This is Magritte at his best. This is a picture called The Rape. This was done in 1935, and then a later Magritte done in 1964, L'Homme au Chapeau Melon. Seems like the man with the hat and the dove, but I'm not sure, a very loose translation on my part. But these are two of our favorites. Sam and I sit in the library and we look at them and we say, oh, it's just like the two of us. There she is, there he is. And we enjoy them a lot. Now we have Giacometti. I had never been familiar before I encountered this work with this early Surrealist period of Giacometti. I knew these forms much more intimately, the very tall femme de Venise and the walking man, and those were the sort of the ones that I recognized. But Giacometti had a wonderful, short but intense surreal moment. I think there are about like a dozen pieces from that time, and we were able to find this one. It's called Femme Couchée, and this is the more typical, which we acquired later, of the woman walking between two houses. Collections are rarely static. At least I hope they're not, because it's not so much fun if they just kind of stay the same way. There are too many tempting tangents to explore along the way. In our case, the MCA's influence on the evolution of our collection has become increasingly evident. As a student of art history, it's fascinating to see themes of an earlier genre appear in the work of a contemporary artist. Here we have an interesting combination. We have Kiki Smith, wonderful sculpture called Woman with Lion. And on the right is Victor Bronner's very surreal work, Au Crépuscule. Both pictures, both the picture and the sculpture, reflecting a very interesting dynamic between a beast and a female. And who knows what these critters are. I don't think I'd want to meet them in a dark alley. Yves Tanguy's biomorphic forms that you see here in this wonderful picture from the 20s are referenced in the sculpture of Aaron Curry, which was a work done in 2009. Same wonderful forms. Alexander Calder, wire sculpture, La Negresse, from 1929, is juxtaposed with Nathan Carter's, oh, where's my, there we go, with Nathan Carter's wire sculpture entitled Bravo Lima Udon Elephant, or Blue, done in 2009. The work of Curry and Carter appeared in a recent exhibition that originated at the MCA, Chicago. Alexander Calder and Contemporary Art, Form, Balance, Joy, was another perfect segue for Surrealism in our collection to contemporary art, as well as an opportunity to begin collecting for the MCA. When I spoke earlier about the profile of this collector, I referred to being a participant in the global art world. One way this can be accomplished is by loaning work to exhibitions in museums nationally or internationally. Another way is to help a museum you are intimately involved with build their permanent collection. In the case of Nathan Carter and Aaron Curry, you have the perfect scenario. These works will live in our collection because they resonate with some very essential themes. They are promised gifts to the MCA, however, and will eventually enter the museum's permanent collection. A win-win for all concerned. The last 12 years have really been extraordinary. Building this collection has been a Herculean effort, one I've enjoyed, though, immensely. Living with the collection is ultimately the reward. So let's have a look in Chicago and see how all of this work, resonates in our life. Here we're looking at the view of the John Hancock Building, which is directly north of our living room and dining room. It's a spectacular building and a gorgeous view of the lakefront and a great backdrop, for whatever is inside. Sometimes it's hard to look at the art because you're too busy looking at what's outside. Now here we are in the living room. Terrific Magritte here, the philosophy of the boudoir, marvelous picture, and juxtaposed with this really interesting, very sexual, I think, work of Louise Bourgeois. It's a little tough to see this, but it's another wonderful Ernst. And there's the Dominguez that you saw earlier, and very early Ernst, sculpture of, oh God, I just forgot his name. Well, we have a lovely Tang horse, all kinds of goodies to look at. A contemporary work, Mark Tansey. Here's another view of the living room, a little more Delvaux and Henry Moore. Nice old Chinese rug. I mean, it all sort of lives nicely together. And this is one of my favorite little assemblages. We have our little Miro moonbird. I mean, our moon. Yes, the moonbird and the Kahlo, the Gorky. This is the other Kahlo that I referred to earlier. Lovely sculpture by de Kooning that makes a reference to a picture you can't see over here, Dorothea Tanning. And this really interesting Mayan bat yoke that's sitting over here on the convector cover. As you'll see later, we have a real interest in ethnographic material, tribal work, whatever you want to call it. But I sort of like to introduce some of it into Chicago. I feel, I don't know, it kind of works with this material as well. What have we next? This is a closer look at the Henry Moore in juxtaposition with the Kahlo, and a wonderful Calder that hangs from above the table that was on the previous slide. The dining room. This is the collection gene gone wild. This is well, pretty much where a lot of the Cornell lives. In fact, I think almost all of the Cornell lives in this room. And it's located on shelves here, and then there are some on stands. There's some down here that you can't see, a couple of pieces up there. But there are all sorts of other things that live together with this work. There's the Suitcase in the Box by Duchamp, wonderful little Dominguez painting, like a little Gottlieb, tiny little Gottlieb picture, which really doesn't have anything to do with anything except I like looking at it. Books that I enjoy, a Calder maquette for a very large sculpture that appears, I think, in St. Louis. I can't remember exactly. Here's an interesting look at the table. There's a wonderful Ernst chess set here. The Surrealists had a great fascination and love for playing chess. They spent hours and hours recreating, over chess sets. And many of them actually designed chess sets in keeping with the spirit of their work. And this is a particularly beautiful one. It just came into the collection. There's a lovely Calder piece here. Fausto Malati, an interesting kind of offshoot for me of Calder, metal sculpture. Another work of Louise Bourgeois. It's just a fun place to be, and it's always changing, moving things around, taking things out, bringing new things in. In the beginning, it was very static. I never wanted to touch anything, and then finally I got over that, and now things move all over the place. It's much more fun. And this is a little close-up at an incredible hotel box, a beautiful piece with this lovely ballerina inside, and she's offset very beautifully by this work of Archipenko, this lovely leaf, form, and they really cohabit very nicely together. Here we have an interesting little setting. We have Max Ernst, the king playing with the queen, a la chess. This is sort of like the ultimate realization of that sport. And then a wonderful, again, a picture by de Chirico from 1915. I forget, the title is La Lumière Fatale, right, another very fine metaphysical painting. And this is another little setting in another part of the house. There's a photograph of Edward Steichen. The subject is Gloria Swanson. I think the picture was done in the early 20s. And then we have a little Jacques Lipchitz sculpture. Nothing surreal about it, more cubist, actually, but I just thought it was a handsome work. And then this very interesting deco light fixture. And below, there's a collection of tea sets, some deco, an occasional Italian from the 60s. But it's that collector gene, surfacing all the time. If one is great, then four is definitely better. And here we have shades of the past. This is my youth coming back to haunt me. This is a children's area, and I have a grandchild who adores ugly dolls and asked me if I could have an ugly doll in the room. And I said, oh, of course you can have an ugly doll. Before I knew it, there were there's actually more. On the other end of the bed, there's like another 10 ugly dolls. And she, of course, is in heaven, and I actually kind of like looking at them too. They're fun. And they're keeping good company with this lovely abstract piece by Judith Rothschild. And now we go into the last room that we're going to look at home. This is another tangent for me. We're looking at some lovely Khmer 11th century sandstone deities. Very, very beautiful. And they're in the foreground, and they're backed up by a monumental work by Roberto Matta. It's huge. A picture called The Pilgrim of Doubt. Striking, striking picture. So, that's Chicago. Now I want you to fasten your seatbelts, and we're going to take a little trip. We're going to go to the West Coast. We're going to end up in Malibu, right on the ocean. We were very fortunate to find this incredible residence almost at the same time that we started the project in Chicago. This next group of slides reveals the exterior and the interior, which you'll see in a minute, of our home in Malibu. The home was designed by John Lautner for another client. We purchased the home, much later. And the house was designed in the 1970s, toward the end of the 70s. Here we have a look inside, and you can start to get a sense of the house and how it sort of dictated for me what went in it. It's filled with these gigantic boulders. The floors are slate. It's all about the earth. And I mean, some people call it the heavy house, because it's so filled with all these rocks. And then there's just the feeling of raw power. And from that, I sort of got to, roots and, very historical work that was of the earth. And I found that it was really sort of the perfect environment for a collection of pre-Columbian sculpture from Mexico, Central and South America, Native American pots from the American Southwest, and sculpture and functional objects from Africa. This installation includes my husband Sam's favorite piece. This is the Kalima dog, which he insists is the best dog that ever was. Strong, very aggressive dog. He loves this dog. I actually like it too. We also have several Jalisco seated women down here. Also two large, very powerful Jalisco females, one here, one here. There are seated and standing Veracruz pieces, and a wonderful Colombian mask of a dignitary. Most of this work dates to somewhere between 100 BC and 250 AD. Hard to be much more specific than that, but it's pretty much in that arena. Here you get a really good look of the Veracruz fellow and these two Jalisco women. One of the wonderful things about African material is their currency. It's gorgeous. We have currency bracelets, and I've found many of these different countries. These are from the Ivory Coast in Nigeria. There's an incredible chief's collar. I can't imagine that anybody ever wore this because it weighs like 15 pounds. I mean, it's incredibly heavy. Of course, maybe if you were a chief, you were able to pull that off. It's from the Bobangi culture in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This wonderful old Zulu vessel was probably used to store beer. And then this lovely Kumu effigy pot. Obviously something resides in the inside, maybe ashes or spirits come out, or I'm not sure what, but she's quite beautiful. Then here we have a lovely ceremonial vessel from Mali and a storage jar from Cameroon. And it sort of feels like this material was always there. I mean, it just kind of grew out of the environment. Here on the left, we have a lovely collection of Casas Grande pots from Mexico. These date to about the 13th to 15th century. And they're shown together with very contemporary Zulu beer vessels, late 20th century. Very handsome and almost have a contemporary feel to them. And then this little fellow I love. He's a Colombian male figure who I think looks like he jumped right out of a Botero painting. I just think he's terrific. And back here you're looking at an herbalist staff from the Yoruba culture in Nigeria. And then over here you can see another currency ring, this one coming from Cameroon. And behind you can see a part of a collection of photography. This is the only place in the house where there's anything other than this ethnographic material. We found this wonderful collection of Ruth Barnhard. They're all nudes and they're just absolutely beautiful. And we just bought the portfolio and put them up, and I love them. They seem to belong in our bedroom, and I love looking at them. More currency rings. I mean, these things are incredible. They all look like a handsome form of jewelry. They're just amazing, but they were used as means of exchange. These are from Liberia. Oh, now this wonderful fellow here. Oh, I love him. He's a smiling figure from Veracruz. And then his little pal here is Zacatecas, another culture in Mexico. It's tough to see the pots, but this is a cochiti pot from the American Southwest. And we'll leave Malibu with Leonora Carrington's bronze sculpture, a surrealist interloper in the ethnographic universe. She's very mysterious. Last but not least, and I really mean not least, I'd love to talk just a little bit about the collector as conservator. I met Jennifer Smith, my everything person, in 2001. I was a techno-illiterate, I mean really bad. I still had a filofax for my calendar. I was in desperate need of training. I had just installed all of this wonderful equipment in our new residence, and I didn't even know how to turn it on, let alone use it. After learning the basics of interfacing with my desktop computer, Jennifer asked me whether I had any aspirations to do anything more than send emails and surf the net. And I quickly responded, well, yes, I'm pretty sure that Sam and I are really working on building a big art collection, in 2 locations. I need a way to keep track of all this stuff. It's already getting the best of me, and I'm so anal that I'm running out of patience to figure out ways to handle this. And there's got to be a much better technological way to do this. Well, she looked at me, and this smile just went over her whole face. Her eyes lit up, and she said, "I can't believe you're saying this. This has been my dream. I've always had a tremendous interest in architecture and art history. Technology is what I'm making my livelihood out of, and I have always yearned for a way to merge the two. And if you'll work with me and let me develop the best way to do this, but sort of go through the learning curve with me, I would love to help you figure out a way to do this." And that's how we began. Jennifer did her homework. I mean, this spun out over quite a number of months, and what we ended up with was a system called the museum system. You probably have seen it in museums if you've ever been to the back rooms of any local museum to see how they catalog and keep track of things. But it's adapted for the private collector's use. It's not quite as complex, although it's pretty complex. It doesn't have all of the permutations and combinations that a large institution would have. But essentially, it's the same. So here, you can see an example of one of many pages of information. You see the image of the piece. You see what it is. It's any kind of information that where the picture lives, how big it is, and then all of the backup pages tell you even more, about the image. That's juxtaposed with the traditional paper file, which we also still keep because at the end of the day, you need to have your hard copy. I mean, as much as we back up everything, God forbid there should be some kind of horrible, technological failure. We want to have this information, so we do both. Our goal is to document everything that we know about a particular piece, what it looks like, its provenance, its exhibition history, publications, value, work done to conserve the piece, installation shots, documentation of loans, articles of interest, on and on and on. So this is a constantly growing and evolving body of information. At the beginning, Jennifer did all of the data entry. She photographed everything that we had. She input all of this material. It took a long time to get this thing all going. And now, assuming that I don't go crazy, periodically and acquire too much in a short period of time, she can keep up with me in a very brilliant fashion. Display has always been, as you saw earlier, something that I really care a lot about. You can see how we've solved the challenge of displaying a group of tiny little miniature jade pieces. This is like a base below here, and there are these wonderful little vertical, tiny little poles, and then each object is mounted, at different heights so that you can see everything, beautifully. I work with an incredible stand maker. If you ever need to do this kind of work, it's good to have a relationship with a good stand maker. He's invaluable. We also came up with this lovely way to display pre-Columbian gold. And now we get to the conclusion of this talk. I'm almost sad that it's over, but I have a wonderful story to share with you, and it has to do with de-accession. We haven't talked about that at all, because it's hard. When you're a collector, it's hard to say, oh, I don't like this anymore. It doesn't belong. I just never want to say that. But you need to. You need to edit. You need to pare down. You need to do this. So the story I'm going to tell you is an interesting one. This slide is entitled, very aptly, "So What's in Your Warehouse?" This is a cautionary tale, but I think you're going to enjoy it. What's in your warehouse? Well, look at this picture here. This is a very interesting picture. I encountered this picture the first night I had dinner with Sam. It hung in the entry hall of his apartment. I remember thinking that it reminded me of the stage set for Fiddler on the Roof. Much later, I learned that Sam had a great affection for the picture, which I must admit I didn't share. When we began our residential construction project, all of Sam's work, all of his decor, everything, went into storage, including the fiddler. When the project was completed 2.5 years later, we had decided to take a very different approach to collecting. So what had been sent to storage stayed in storage. Sometime later, Jennifer embarked on a crusade, borderline on harassment from time to time, but we'll call it a crusade. She kept saying to me, "Why do you do this? Why do you spend thousands of dollars keeping in storage material that you are never, ever going to look at again? You don't like it. You don't care about it. It's not of any interest to you. Do something about it. I'll do it for you. I'll go and I'll unpack it all. I'll analyze it. We'll decide what to do together." So finally, I decided that maybe she had a point. It really was stupid to keep doing this. So, to make a long story short, together, after her big analysis of all of the work that was in the storage facility, we decided to make a gift to a local residential housing charity that served children of parents with AIDS. And it was wonderful. They adored receiving the work. They were thrilled beyond belief. They even were able to sell some of it that they couldn't use, so they generated money for their institution. But Jennifer was not willing to give this picture up. She comes to me and she says, I know this sounds strange, but I have this feeling about this picture. I just don't think it's like all the rest. I think it's different, and I think it's special, and I'd love the opportunity to do a little research. And I said, okay, go ahead, knock yourself out. Whatever you want to do is fine. I figured we've gotten rid of most of the stuff, so if she wants to do some more research, fine, I'll let her do the research. She's very, very good at this. Ultimately, after a couple of months playing around with this, doing a lot of research, she discovered that Vasily Shukev, who's the artist who painted this picture, was a very important Russian artist, which led her to consult with a Russian specialist at Christie's. Vasily Shukev's painting, Finnish Village Roofs, was painted in 1920, while the artist was briefly living in Finland, making his way to Paris after the Russian Revolution. Christie's catalog for its London Russian art sale in June of 2009 described it as among the finest of Vasily Shukev's distinctive series of works depicting the Finnish landscape. In fact, they were so enthusiastic about the picture that they made it the cover lot of the sale. In 1988, Sam purchased this picture at the Chicago International Art Exposition for $19,000. It was sold in 2009, including the buyer's premium, for $1,200,000. This was, and is, the third highest price paid for a shoe cave at auction. Thank you. And if there are questions, I'm here. Happy to entertain any questions you might have. Betsy?
When you range so far across so many cultures and centuries, how do you find the expert who can educate you, or how do you study up to become capable of collecting at the highest standard in so many different arenas?
Well, to be very, very honest, I started collecting before I had a lot of this very specific knowledge. And the reason it worked most of the time was because we were cherry picking the best collectors. So yes, you could still make a mistake, but I started reading and learning after the fact. And the more we got, the more I started spending time with curators and getting reading lists and developing a library. And it's only in the last couple of years that I've really gotten up to speed on maybe 2 or 3 of these artists. Certainly not all of them. A lot of this for me is about the visual. The one thing that's tricky, as opposed to buying emerging artists, you're dealing with big dollars, and I come from a very humble background. So for me to make that kind of an investment without somebody assuring me that this is okay, so I go to people and I ask, but they generally are museum curators, an art dealer that I really trust implicitly. There are very few, but I do have a couple of relationships with some wonderful dealers, and then friends who collect similar material. Although it's hard with surrealism, there are not too many people that live in my neighborhood, but I'm finding them. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience for me today to see Robert Lehrman's collection. I mean, I'm still moved, from the experience, and I only want to now go back and read more and learn more. I mean, I have a pretty decent library about Cornell, but I got a new book today, so I'm going to go pore over that and see what I can find out. Yes?
You have documented it so well. Is that available to the general museum, to museums within the country? If you were looking at Chicago, for instance, I worked on some Russian exhibitions. Would I be able to find this via?
You might. I mean, I'm sure they would probably. I'm sure Christie's would come up, but there's a lot of information written about him. And if you're interested in that particular work, I can certainly. Oh, I see what you're saying. I'm sorry. At this point, we've never done anything like that. Most of the work that we do is generated for my interest and the few people who are in my world, or like maybe locally. But I've never done anything nationally. In fact, the fact that this is being streamed is like, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine.
I've sort of the opposite question as the first. What's good reading material when you're not in serious research mode? What do you read for kicks when you're not when you're not trying to?
My art reading or my regular reading?
Specifically art reading.
Well, like one really big example that comes to mind is when I read Hayden Herrera's biography of Gorky. That was one of the best books I ever read, but that's just a great read. And this was before we owned the Gorky. It was just a great book. It was terrific.
Can I tack on one little sub-question?
Sure.
Is there such thing, or can you hear me?
It's being recorded, so that's why.
Oh, all right. Is there such a thing as, for someone that's really interested in art, is there such a thing as kind of junk food reading, like stuff that it's fun for you to look at, but it doesn't enrich your knowledge of anything? Is there anything like that? Any kind of magazine that you like? Any kind of reading? That's kind of an odd question.
Art in America certainly not. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of an interesting question. I spent a lot of time just looking at catalogs and pictorial stuff. I mean, I love looking at pictures. And I spend endless hours looking at pictures, you know, reading less, especially in the beginning. I looked at a lot of pictures. Serious academic work is much more challenging, and sometimes I'm not up for it, but I love to look at the, you know, the easier, the coffee table books, you know, if the illustrations are really done well. Like the retrospective, if an artist has a retrospective at a museum, those are usually great catalogs to look at. Any of the really big blockbuster shows, you know, that any of the big museums do, those catalogs are always lots of fun because they're, I don't know, there's just not as much heavy-duty material to deal with. But yeah, I like to look at things that have visuals. Yes?
Chicago is known for its printmaking. All the printmakers. Do you collect print?
Well, I had one once, Frank Galla. I am not, the only work on paper that we have now is our drawings, but I have not pursued, you know, any, you know, multiples on paper anymore. I think because I got so involved with, you know, unique pieces, I just love them. I don't know, I like the fact that there's one. Photography is the only departure there. I mean, those are definitely prints and can be pretty hairy. Yes. I have one Westerman piece, and it came into the collection after we did the Westerman show. And I'd always been exposed to the Westermans in the MCA's collection, and I loved the work. But when they did the big, huge retrospective, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I wanted to own everything, and it had nothing to do with anything, you know, that we had. But there was one wonderful piece that became available, and it's sort of like a box. It's this little caged box, and there's like a little figure inside, you know, with a tire hanging in it. He looks like he's in jail, and it's called Stars and Bars, and I can't remember what you've got to, I mean, there's a music reference and guitars. But the box concept made it work for me, because there was all this Cornell, and then there's this wonderful Westerman box. And I love seeing the two, you know, juxtaposed. Yes?
With the recent increase in, with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the recent increase in hostilities internationally, I was just wondering, with all of the Francisco de Goya paintings that depict such violent images, have you noticed a recent increase in the collection of those types of works, or has it been about the same?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, in contemporary art, certainly there's, you know, that's what I'm exposed to the most on an ongoing basis in terms of new work. There's a lot of violence. Not all of it necessarily about, you know, political situations, although some do relate to political situations, but there's always stuff being done about violence to women and violence to children. And I mean, there's some of the stuff that's done today is hard for me to even look at. You know, people's flesh being flayed, and I mean, yeah, there's a lot of violence. Now, you could say that maybe it was, you know, there was subliminal stuff going on, that maybe people are reacting to all of this, you know, that's going on in the world, and I expect that there will be more pictures like that. In fact, there was a piece that was installed at the MCA a couple of years ago. There were people sitting and talking about the war in Iraq, you know, having conversations, and there was a backdrop, which I can't describe, which sort of sat on the wall, some kind of a draped fabric. But the basic point of the piece was to hear these conversations that different people were having with different perspectives about the war. And this was specifically about that. It was fascinating. So I think you're right. I think there will be more. Yes?
I had a specific question about Hans Bellmer. I think I heard you say something about collaborations that,
Yes.
There was a particular name that I've come across, and I was curious if anyone had found any collaborations. She was a poet, a Greek poet, Giselle Prazinos.
Not to my knowledge, but I'd sure like to know.
Yeah, she's actually still alive, and I've only found one collaboration between the two, and I just am dying for more information about any possible
How do you spell her last name?
Prassinos, something like that, I believe.
Oh, well, now I'm going to
Yeah,
look.
it was-
I mean, I have the ones that are more common, like Paul Eluard and
Right,
Lanier
right.
and all the, you know.
Yeah, so that was their, just the idea of them collaborating would be really interesting because, you know, he was kind of interested in poetry as well.
Yes.
So she was, I think, 14 or 15 when, at the time. So, I mean, that would just be really very interesting. And then for the gentleman who was looking for reading material, I just read Steve Martin's An Object of Beauty. It's
Oh, what a great example.
Yeah.
I just read it too not that long
yeah,
ago.
it was. I mean, a quick
Yeah.
read. It, you know.
Right.
So I mean, I don't know. I would recommend it. I don't know if you would as well.
Thank you for reminding me.
Sure.
No, it's really a fun read. And, you know, there are some interesting characters in it. Like, I love the Larry Gagosian reference and all. I mean, it's good. It's fun. Anyone else?
On the quick read, do you want anything else again? I bought Andy Warhol.
Oh, a couple of friends have read that as well. Well, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this. Thanks for coming.